Now, you may well not have heard of me. Leigh Hunt is my name, but the verdict of history is that I was a key associate of the younger Romantic poets, Keats, Shelley and Byron. I was a poet too, damn it, but I have to admit completely outclassed by the other three. However, some of my stuff is still around and widely anthologized, oh yes. I'll run this past you, see what you think. It was in the middle of my life. I was living in Chelsea. I had money worries. I'd been under the weather as well. But when I called in on my neighbour, his lovely wife Jenny, well, she just leapt up and kissed me. So I thought, let the ravages of time do their worst. They can never take that away from me. Jenny kissed me when we met, jumping from the chair she sat in. Time, you thief who loves to get sweets into your list, put that in. Say I'm weary, say I'm sad, say that health and wealth have missed me. Say I'm growing old, but Jenny kissed me. In my day, poetry was all the rage, but I gather that in your era, music has moved into the space it then occupied. And that made me think that perhaps we were a bit like that band you will have heard of, the Fab Four, John, Paul, George and Ringo, the Beatles, the four lads from Liverpool who rocked the world. It's even occurred to me that we could be called the First Fab Four, John, George, Leigh and Percy, that is, John Keats, George Gordon, Lord Byron, myself Leigh Hunt and Percy Bysshe Shelley. You may well be wondering how I happen to know about the Beatles, their lives and their works. Well, I think it's something to do with this new thing called the internet. As I died in 1859, I'm obviously in some ethereal space somewhere. Well, now there's something called cyberspace, apparently, and what I think is happening is that information from there, somehow or another, is leaking over to me. Because recently I've been getting these kind of flashes from a later century. And do you know, when I heard about the Beatles, well, I really perked up. I mean, Beatlemania was obviously a huge sensation, and I could not help but compare it to the time when Lord Byron rocketed to fame with his first massive hit. It was just so similar. I awoke and found myself famous, he wrote. And just as your Mr. Paul McCartney was a particular favourite with the ladies, so Lord Byron also had innumerable female admirers. In fact, he once told me, the number of anonymous portraits, love letters and proposals that I received, and all from English ladies, would be enough to fill a large volume. The sales of his works were simply sensational. Carriages thronged round his publisher's office. As Shelley said, he struck a chord to which 1,000,000 hearts responded. So that's where I started to think that you could look back on us and kind of see us as a sort of Beatles-type grouping. Then I began to see all kinds of other similarities. Some were trivial, perhaps. I mean, just as your Beatles, I believe, wore their hair in a certain manner that I gather was highly distinctive, so we pioneered an equally original new look. We wore our collars soft and turned down, scorning the high, stiff collars that were the standard fashion of the time. Then there were parallels which seemed deeper and more mysterious. Perhaps it began to dawn on me, we were comparable creative influences who, in a phrase of Shelley's, touched the world with living flame. So I thought that if I told you about my three friends, Keats, Shelley and Byron, and how I fitted in, then maybe you might start to see us as foreshadowing their extraordinary lives. Indeed, by the time I've finished my little disquisition, I hope you will agree that my notion that we were the first Fab Four might very well be justified. So let me start by introducing the one and only Lord Byron, with a verse he wrote about a young lady on the dance floor. She was dark and beautiful, and wearing a black spangled dress that reminded him of the night skies he'd seen on his travels to the east. She walks in beauty like the night of cloudless climes and starry skies, and all that's best of dark and bright meet in her aspect and her eyes. One shade the more, one ray the less, had half impaired the nameless grace, which waves in every raven tress, or softly lightens o'er her face. Early on I was living on Hampstead Heath, in a great little cottage which I filled with books and copies of Greek statues. That was some time after I had been released from prison for libelling the Prince Regent in my paper, The Examiner. I had called him a fat Adonais of 40, and the judge had held this to be a scandalous and defamatory libel. This had been when we first came together as one. All three poets supported me. Shelley wrote introducing himself and enclosing a £20 note as well. John Keats, an avid Examiner reader, was shocked by the sentence and later celebrated my release in verse. Lord Byron visited me in prison on many occasions. He described me as the wit in the dungeon, and was even kind enough to say that a book of poems I had published at the age of 16 had inspired him to become a poet. It was only after my release, though, that I met Keats and Shelley. One day a friend brought round this young man who was a medical student at Guy's Hospital. It was John Keats, and his friend thought I should see one of his poems. As I believe you would say, it completely blew me away. Well, I printed it immediately, and so first brought him to the world's attention. From that time on, one of his friends said, he was lost to medicine. I helped him in other ways too. Through me he discovered the model of the Italian story poem, and this perhaps made its way into his poem La Belle Dame sans Merci, where the knight-at-arms meets a beautiful girl in the meadows, but somehow is sadly led astray. I give you John Keats. I met a lady in the meads, full beautiful of fairies' child. Her hair was long, her foot was light, and her eyes were white. She found me roots of relish sweet, and honey wild and manna dew. And sure in language strange she said, I love thee true. She took me to her elfin grot, and there she wept and sighed full sore. And there I shut her wild, wild eyes with kisses full. And there she lulled me asleep, and there I dreamed our woe betide, the latest dream I ever dreamed on the cold hillside. Princes too, pale warriors, death pale were they all. They cried La Belle Dame sans Merci, hath thee enthralled. And this is why I sojourn here, alone and palely loitering, though the sedge is withered from the lake, and no birds sing. In the very next issue I published one of Shelley's poems, thereby introducing him as well to a wider audience. Shelley was in some ways the most far-seeing of the group, at times impulsive, reckless, it's true, but he was filled with a generosity that was far extending. He would defy the manners and beliefs of the age. Just because everyone says something, he would say, that does not make it true. In time he would declare that I was his best and truest friend, and our paths would cross again, even after he had moved to Italy. So finally I give you Percy Bysshe Shelley, with a little love lyric he wrote in that beautiful country. The fountains mingle with the river, and the river with the ocean. The winds of heaven mix forever with a sweet emotion. And sunlight clasps the earth, and the moonbeams kiss the sea. What is all this sweet work worth, if thou kiss not me? So that was us, but we should not go on before bringing a certain young lady into the frame. This was Mary Wollstonecraft Godwin, who, aged only 19, would bring an extraordinary story into being. This, of course, was the tale of Dr. Frankenstein, and the creature he gave life to and then abandoned. Now Lord Byron, having taken London by storm, had crashed out of favour in grand style when his marriage imploded. There were the most scandalous of rumours circulating, but I defended him in the Examiner, of course. He took a villa on the shores of Lake Geneva, and it was here that Shelley and Mary first made his acquaintance. One night the two poets were talking about the latest discoveries, electricity, galvanism, and whether they could stimulate life itself. These thoughts later that night helped to kindle the story in Mary's mind. That was a momentous summer indeed. The story of Frankenstein was born, and also Shelley came to national attention for his questioning of religious orthodoxies. You see, most English visitors to the Alps came to a simple conclusion. This magnificent scenery proves without doubt the existence of God. And when Shelley checked into his hotel, he found a previous visitor had written just that in the register. In reply, as he signed in, he put his occupation as atheist and his destination as l'enfer. Well, this got into the London papers and caused no end of a stir. It was very like when your Mr. John Lennon infuriated the religiously orthodox, though Shelley's challenge, I think, was deliberate rather than accidental. He became known as the Great Atheist, a title he actually relished. He saw it as throwing down a gauntlet to what he saw as an unthinking acceptance of what, in all honesty, could only be uncertain. Yet he thought deeply about the world of the spirit, the nature of man, the human mind. I think in essence he saw creativity as a way of tapping into humanity's deepest reservoirs. There is no God, or rather, there is no creative God. The hypothesis of a pervading spirit, co-eternal with the universe, remains unshaken. This power arises from within. Poetry redeems from decay the visitations of the divinity in man. O thou immortal deity, whose throne is in the depth of human thought, I do adjure thy power and thee. By all that man may be, by all that he is not, by all that he has been, and yet must be. So there was, I always thought, a natural piety to Shelley, but the world would not see this, especially after his first wife Harriet, who he had left for Mary, committed suicide by drowning herself in the Serpentine. Her suicide was a huge crisis for Shelley, and this was when I got to know him properly. As with Byron, I would support him through his troubles. Shelley and Mary were married. They stayed in England for another 18 months or so, oversaw the publication of Frankenstein, but then left for Italy. As soon as he had arrived, he was inviting me to visit him there, but I had all my responsibilities with the Examiner, and had started some other publications too. It was through my paper that Shelley heard of a momentous event in our history, the Peterloo Massacre, when demonstrators in Manchester who were simply calling for the right to vote were savagely dispersed. Within weeks he had sent me his response, The Mask of Anarchy, and shorter poems including his Song to the Men of England. From what I've been learning, it seems that the leading Beatle, Mr. John Lennon, also called for power to the people, so he and my friend Shelley were definitely on the same wavelength. Unfortunately, I knew that if I published Shelley's poems, I would face another long jail term, and I just could not take the risk. John Keats, too, was deeply troubled by the massacre, and in London saw a tumultuous crowd greeting survivors from the day's carnage. But the poem he wrote soon after was very different to Shelley's. A month after Peterloo he went walking in the fields outside Winchester, and wrote something of great sweetness and harmony. I've often wondered to myself which of the Beatles' songs it was most like, and eventually thought of Mr. Paul McCartney's song Let It Be. In times of difficulty you can reach inside yourself for a special kind of stillness, and that, in my opinion, is what the two works have in common. How beautiful the season is now, a temperate sharpness in the air. Somehow a stubble plain looks warm. This struck me so much on my walk that I composed upon it. Season of mists and mellow fruitfulness, close bosom friend of the maturing sun, conspiring with him how to load and bless with fruit the vines that drown the thatch eaves run, bend with apples the mossed cottage trees, and fill all fruit with ripeness to the core, to swell the gourd and plump the hazel shells, with a sweet kernel to set budding more, and still more later flowers for the bees, till they think warm days will never cease. For summer has all brimmed their clammy sails. Of spring, aye, where are they? Think not of them, thou hast thy music too. While barred clouds bloom the soft dying day, and touch the stubble plains with rosy hue, then in a wailful choir the small gnats mourn among the river sallows borne aloft, or sinking as the light wind lives or dies, and full-grown lambs loud bleat from hilly bourne. Hedge crickets sing, and now with treble soft the red-breast whistles from a garden croft. Gathering swallows twitter in the sky. Now I can imagine that to you there might not seem to be anything particularly controversial about John Keats and his work. In fact, though, he was declaring war on the prevailing poetic style. He was reaching back to the poetry of Shakespeare's time, rich, elusive and mysterious. Lord Byron had it easy, for he wrote in the classical common-sense style everyone was familiar with. So when Keats attacked Alexander Pope, his hero, his anger was unrestrained. "Send me no more books by that John Keats, or whatever his name is. It is piss-a-bed poetry, bedlam visions, produced by raw pork and opium." Well, it sounds bad, I know, but I gather your Beatles also had their moments. "We had our quarrels, but we were brothers, really," I believe one of them said, and that applied to us too. The truth was that young John Keats was bringing something new to the poetry of the day, something strange and unfamiliar. And his association with me, with my reforming politics and my own poetry, made him a target for the critics on the side of the status quo. They had dubbed us the Cockney School, with me the so-called King of the Cockneys. When they heard of his background in medicine, that he had gained his apothecary's certificate, they launched a cruel assault. "Back to the shop, Mr. John, back to plasters, pills and ointment boxes. And for heaven's sake be a little more sparing of the extenuatives and soporifics in your practice than you have been in your poetry." Actually, he did not mind this too much, saying that he was a far sterner critic of his own work than they could ever be. So he courageously followed his own path, abandoning what would have been a well-paid career in medicine. "I think I shall be among the English poets after I die," he once said to me after he had returned to his Hampstead home. I was not seeing him so much as before, but we were living fairly close to each other, and I called in on him as soon as I heard that something serious had happened. He always had to worry about money, that was the trouble. And so he insisted on travelling back from town one bitterly cold night on the top of the coach instead of in the snug inside. When he arrived home he was staggering as if drunk. "For God's sake, John," said his friend and landlord, "you must get to bed at once." And then, as he was getting into bed and his friend was bringing him some brandy, Keats coughed softly into a handkerchief. There was blood on it, and with his medical training, he knew exactly what was happening. "I know the colour of that blood," he said. "It is arterial blood. I cannot be deceived in that colour. That drop of blood is my death warrant. I must die." When I have fears that I may cease to be, before my pen has gleaned my teeming brain, before high-piled books in character hold like rich garners the full ripened grain. When I behold upon the night-starred face huge cloudy symbols of a high romance, and think that I may never live to trace their shadows with the magic hand of charms. And when I feel, fair creature of an hour, that I shall never look upon thee more, never have relish in the fairy power of unreflecting love. Then on the shore of the wide world I stand alone and think, till love and fame to nothingness do sink. His many friends rallied round him, and his publishers hastened to bring out what would be his last collection of poems. Shelley invited him to stay in Pisa in Italy, where he had settled, and where he thought the warm climate could help his recovery. Keats, however, would never get there. That autumn he set out for Rome. Hearing that he could not bear to receive letters, I asked his companion, Joseph Seven, to tell him that we shall never cease to remember and love him, and that he is only before us on the road, and that we are coming after him. I believe, though, that he died before the letter arrived. This was the first death amongst us. When Shelley saw reports that the vicious reviews were to blame, he began work on his great poem Adonais. He insisted that Keats was a truly great poet, and accused his critics of nothing less than murder. Now, so far I've mentioned Mr. Paul McCartney and Mr. John Lennon. Now I can let you know that I've also heard about Mr. George Harrison. What interested me was that just as Shelley wrote a tribute about his lost friend, so Mr. Harrison wrote one for his friend John. You see, I heard what happened in New York when the first member of the Beatles was taken so cruelly from human shores. I compared what they said, and listen to this. Mr. Harrison wrote that John was now in the realm of light. My friend Shelley wrote that Keats was now part of the white radiance of eternity. Mr. Harrison called the man who murdered his companion the devil's best friend. Shelley called the reviewer a deaf and viperous murderer, a nameless worm, a noteless blot on a remembered name. Lord Byron, however, was by no means convinced by Shelley's account. He invited him to Ravenna, and there, Shelley told me later, he told him of his reservations.
I am very sorry to hear what you have to say about Keats, but is it actually true? Surely criticism is not so killing. I remember the effect of the Edinburgh Review on me after they had trounced my first poem. Why, Shelley, I drank 3 bottles of wine and sat down to make a reply. I felt rage and resistance and redress, but not despondency or despair. I grant that these are not amiable feelings, but in this life of bustle and broil, and especially in the career of writing, a man should calculate his powers of resistance before he goes into the arena.
I know now that it was Byron rather than Shelley who was right. What you called tuberculosis, but we called consumption, had taken him. But Shelley had also been working hard to convince Byron of the merits of Keats's work, and in particular of his long poem Hyperion, which had come out in his final book. Byron, despite his previous fierce condemnation of Keats, had had to admit that it was actually rather good.
I have read it. It is as sublime as Aeschylus, and will certainly keep his name alive.
Well, that was a great advance. To go from piss-a-bed poetry to being as sublime as Aeschylus, and all before the age of 25, that was really something. In Ravenna, the two poets also discussed the increasingly fierce attacks on them by the poet laureate Robert Southey.
He has accused me of corrupting the youth and literature of our country. Poor guiltless I. This is my answer to him. Ridicule is the only weapon the English climate cannot rust, and in the present clash of philosophy and tyranny it is necessary to throw away the scabbard. It is called the vision of judgment. The only question is whom to get to print it. Mr. John Murray, my publisher, is the most nervous of God's booksellers, and will not even look at it while he has a prosecution hanging over him from my last book.
At this point, Shelley had a suggestion to make. Had his lordship not once harboured a desire to set up a journal, a periodical? Well, why not establish one now and publish this in the first issue? The great poet was interested.
I would support that. But how could it be done here?
Well, Shelley replied, there is one man we know who understands the machinery as well as the soul of such a venture. Leigh Hunt, editor of the Examiner.
When party feeling ran highest against me, Hunt was the only editor, the only literary man who dared to take my side. I'll always be grateful to him for that. I would advance the money for his journey from England if he could come to be our editor. It would be useful, certainly, to have a means of reply, for I have heard recently that the bullies of the Quarterly Review are itching to be at me, and that a set to is inevitable and imminent. They hate me and I detest them, but they shall not interrupt the march of my mind, nor prevent me from telling the tyrants who are attempting to trample on all thought that their thrones shall yet be rocked to their foundations. Mark my words, my dear Shelley, we shall have some sparring before long.
And so it was that I would be drawn back into the two poets' orbit, which was to centre on the dull, humdrum but congenial city of Pisa. We were to set up our own project, a bit like your Beatles when they established their Apple Corps. I saw that was described as the longest cocktail party in history, though I don't quite know what a cocktail is. We certainly didn't have them in our day. Perhaps they demonstrate the progress made by humanity since our time. Some months later, Lord Byron would leave Ravenna and set off for his new home. From what Shelley told me later, I gathered that his lordship was delighted with his new quarters.
I have got into a famous old feudal palazzo on the Arno, with dungeons below, and so full of ghosts that my servant Fletcher begged leave to change his room, and then refused to occupy his new room because there were more ghosts there than in the other.
In his turn, Shelley was delighted to have attracted his famous friend to Pisa. "Give me a place to stand," Archimedes had said, "and I will move the world." For Shelley, Pisa was that place, and our journal would be the means by which we would move it. By now Shelley had invited me to Pisa to be Lord Byron's editor. Lord Byron would fit up the ground floor of his palace for me and would fund my journey to Italy. The profits from the journal, with the celebrated Lord Byron on board, would undoubtedly be very great, he said. In addition, we could meet up in Italy, and of course our journal would advocate reform of Parliament and hit back at our many critics. So in the end I had agreed, and now was preparing to move myself and my family to Pisa. Over the years I had made enemies of the Tory journals both north and south of the border. I had savaged them with my pen, and in reply they attacked my politics, and my poetry too. They said that it was vulgar, and showed what happened when people of low rank tried to write poetry. So now, when they heard that their so-called aristocracy of letters, that is Lord Byron, was making an alliance with me, the vulgar Cockney, and with Shelley, the dangerous atheist, their consternation knew no bounds. It has come to our attention that out in Italy some young English expatriates have formed a colony. Lord Byron is the leader of this sorry crew, who from now on shall be well known as the Satanic School. I would like to see them on the Judgment Day, even if they repent upon their deathbeds, their sins will not be washed away. Shelley is an atheist, Byron a libertine, and now we hear this sorry pair have planned a magazine. We should not even mention them, but think that it is right, as over an open sewer in the street the watchman hangs a light. Out in Italy, some young English expatriates have formed a colony. Lord Byron is the leader of this sorry crew, who from now on shall be well known as the Satanic School. Beware all young and innocent of the Satanic School. Beware all young and innocent of the Satanic School. I think the French have a saying that too much is nothing, and that ridiculous label, the Satanic School, never caught on. It failed as badly as their other effort, the Cockney School. I always delighted in pointing out that two of our greatest poets, Chaucer and Milton, had been born within earshot of the Bow Bells, and so were fully accredited Cockneys. There was no shame being in their company, I would say. In fact, these insults only helped our cause. One journalist wrote, "This college of infidelity, funded, supported and directed by the noble lord, will no doubt make a considerable noise in the world." So prospects for the journal looked good. It was just a pity that Keats could not have been part of it. If he had survived and taken up Shelley's invitation to Pisa, well, who knows what could have happened. As it was, though, my family and I were delayed by massive storms that raged all winter. When we finally arrived in Italy, I found that the closely knit group in Pisa was coming apart. Everyone is in despair and everything in confusion, was how Shelley put it. He had sailed down from his house up the coast, the Casa Magni in Lerici, to settle me into my quarters, and he exerted every effort to sort things out with Lord Byron. Thanks to him, the journal was put on a sound footing, so that was a great relief. I had no other means of support. With all that out of the way, we had a bit of time to catch up. He was in brilliant spirits and kept saying how inexpressibly glad he was to see me. Finally, we had met up in Italy. He wrote me a little poem of welcome, which to my eternal regret I lost, and told me he was writing again after feeling discouraged by his proximity to Lord Byron. Then, he said, forlornly and surely wrongly, the sun had extinguished the glowworm. As we were visiting the cathedral and the organ was playing, he assented most warmly to an opinion I expressed, that a truly divine religion might yet be established, if charity were made the principle of it instead of faith. Later on, in a striking phrase, he said that he felt he was standing on a precipice, which he had reached with great peril, and could not climb down from without even greater danger. He added that he was content if the heaven above was calm for the passing moment. His eyes lit up as he described how, in his new boat, they would glide through the bay of Lerici, in the evening wind, under the summer moon, until, he said, the earth appeared another world. Their friends Ned and Jane Williams were with them. He had bought her a guitar, and other evenings were spent on their balcony overlooking the sea. He said he listened with excessive delight as she played it under the stars. The keen stars were twinkling, and the fair moon was rising. Among them, dear Jane. The guitar was tinkling, but the notes were not sweet till you sung them again. The stars will awaken, though the moon sleep a full hour later tonight. No leaf will be shaken while the dews of your melody scatter delight. Though the sound overpowers, sing again with your dear voice, revealing a tone of some world far from ours, where music and moonlight and feeling are one. When he left me to return there, I entreated him that if the weather was violent, not to give way to his daring spirit and venture to sea. I also gave him my copy of Keats's poems, and told him to keep it till he could return it with his own hands. He promised me he would be careful. I never beheld him more. The night after he had sailed there was a tremendous storm of thunder and lightning which made us very anxious. When I heard some days later that he was missing, I underwent one of the sensations which we read of in books but seldom experience. I was tongue-tied with horror. A dreadful interval followed. Finally our worst fears were confirmed. A body had been washed on shore near the village of Viareggio. By dress and stature, and by the fact that my copy of Keats was in his jacket pocket, it was clear that it was that of our friend. It was decided that his body would be burnt on the shore after the good ancient fashion, and it was at his funeral that we were last together as one. Byron and I were both mourners there, and the volume of Keats, which Shelley had clearly been reading on the boat, was cast onto the pyre. One small thing consoled me. My review of Shelley's elegy for Keats' Adonais had appeared in the Examiner the very day before he died. I felt that I had stood by him to the last, and by Keats, against those mean-spirited critics who devalued true genius. Then we went back to Pisa, and my family and I settled into the ground floor of his lordship's palace, the Palazzo Lanfranchi. I began work on the first edition of our journal. At first things were very good with Lord Byron. He would stay up late writing his Don Juan, under the influence of gin and water, then get up late, breakfast, read a bit, lounge about, sing something, generally from Rossini, have a bath, dress, and then descend, still singing, into the garden at the back of the house. He would greet me with some pleasantry, and then we would sit and talk. The garden was small and square, but plentifully stocked with oranges and other shrubs. It was also well watered and looked very green and refreshing under the Italian sky. Then we would be joined by his Teresa, la Contessa Teresa Guiccioli, with her sleek tresses, and we would talk with her of Dante, Ariosto, and Boccaccio. One morning he came down. He had obviously been reading Keats, and he asked me what was the meaning of his line, "A beaker full of the warm south." It was most unusual to see him out of his depth, as it were. The truth was that he was not used to these poetical concentrations. We would also talk, of course, about our lost friend Shelley. He was the best and least selfish man I ever knew, he would say. He was poetry itself, and would have attained great fame had he not written utopias and set himself up as a reformer. He was tested in the school of adversity only, which is less challenging than that of success. We would also go riding, and my wife Marianne made a fine silhouette of Lord Byron after his return from one of our daily excursions. But things did not stay so congenial. He found my children difficult, and Marianne was, well, quite outspoken. Once he was saying to us that someone had been speaking against his morals, and what did we think of that? "It is the first time I ever heard of them," she replied crisply. Later on I made the mistake of relaying her comment that a new drawing of him made him look like a great schoolboy who had a plain bun given him rather than a plum one. Oh dear, none of that helped. Then we set off for Genoa, and I have to record that we spent a very sorry winter there. It was like the final days of the Beatles. As Mr. Harrison said, the game was up. Mary and I were quarrelling about Shelley's heart. It had been snatched from the funeral pyre and given to me. She thought it should be hers by right. In addition, Lord Byron's accountant doled money grudgingly out to me. You should have seen his face. When I heard that song, "You Never Give Me Your Money," it seemed to be another bond between our two bands of brothers, telling so beautifully of parting and of sorrowful endings. Then our journal, which had started well, began to lose impetus. I think without Shelley's encouragement it was doomed. The next thing was that Lord Byron had a new direction to follow. The Greeks had risen against their Ottoman overlords, and 2 members of the London Greek Committee came to ask for his support. This awakened all his feelings for Greek freedom. mountains look on Marathon. Marathon looks on the sea, and musing there an hour alone, I dreamed that Greece might still be free. The mountains look on Marathon, and Marathon looks on the sea, and musing there an hour alone, I dreamed that Greece might still be free. Yet freedom, yet thy banner torn but flying, streams like the thunderstorm against the wind. Yet freedom, yet thy banner torn but flying, streams like the thunderstorm against the wind. The dead have been awakened, shall I sleep? The world's at war with tyrants, shall I crouch? The harvest ripened, shall I pause to reap? I slumber not, the thorn is in my couch. Each day a trumpet soundeth, its echo in my heart. The mountains look on Marathon, Marathon looks on the sea, and musing there an hour alone, I dreamed that Greece might still be free. And so he set off for Greece, and we separated for good. I could not help thinking of our first meeting, when I was a hero to him, the young poet and editor, the martyr for free speech, the wit in the dungeon. Now I was just another supplicant, a recipient of his generosity. I heard that very smart phrase you have, from hero to zero, and I cannot deny it applied to me with painful accuracy. In fact, he left without even saying goodbye to me. So there we were, stuck in Genoa. Mary went back to London, with Shelley's heart, to find that her Frankenstein was playing on the London stage. After a while we set off for Florence. It was there that I heard of Byron's death in Missolonghi, taken by a malarial fever after only a few months. The news shocked Europe. Never had the death of a poet caused such a sensation, someone wrote. It came upon London like an earthquake. Now I don't think another poet's death would have such an effect until your Mr. John Lennon died in that dark New York gateway. You had control of our smiles and our tears, Mr. Harrison wrote about him. And that very much applied to his lordship as well. For over a decade he had held everyone's attention. Now he was gone. For many it was like the sun had gone out of the sky. I know that he and I had, fallen out quite badly, should we say, but he ended up by doing me quite a favour. In fact, it was thanks to Lord Byron that I managed to get home. I can see that the flood of publications about the Beatles is still continuing long after they had parted. There was the same public fascination with Lord Byron after his death. There had been so many admiring memoirs and accounts of him that a London publisher wanted something a bit different. A knocking job, I think you would say. I duly obliged. The advance paid for our journey home, and mighty glad I was to get back. But that book, Lord Byron and some of his contemporaries, has been held to be the biggest blot on my career. So what did I say about him? I suppose I was a bit excessive. He was vain, insincere, avaricious, superstitious, ignorant of love, and what was more, his poetry was totally derivative. No, it was not my finest hour, and I am very sorry about it now. I softened my opinions later, though. May peace rest on all his infirmities, and his fame brighten as it advances. I heard that line, "It's getting very near the end," in a Beatles song, and right now it seems very apt. For a start, I'm beginning to feel quite a bit older suddenly. It's funny how these things happen. In addition, we are approaching the conclusion of my bid to persuade you that we indeed merit the title the First Fab Four. But in fairness, I must introduce a dissenting opinion here, because I did hear one of the Beatles' friends saying that the Beatles hadn't happened before and wouldn't happen again. Strictly speaking, I have to admit that he was right. I mean, they rocketed to fame as a group, whereas in our time only Lord Byron could match them. But I saw the reputations of Keats and Shelley steadily draw level with his as the years passed. Even those wretched magazines that had attacked them started to print odes in their honour. So Keats, Shelley and Byron, with me very much alongside, please don't forget, became a 19th century supergroup. Surely then, in the end, the First Fab Four. But you can see how John Keats for ages lagged far behind the noble lord in popular estimation, while new Byron editions, memoirs and knocking jobs poured from the presses. 25 years after Keats had died, his poor publisher sold his copyrights for a mere £50. However, just as Mr. George Harrison is seen as having the best songs on their final song collection, so Keats, the quiet one of our group, came to be seen as contributing the very finest of our work. "A thing of beauty is a joy forever," he had written. Perhaps that lovely phrase is at the heart of what connects us across the centuries. Those centuries have seen that the critics who argued that only people of rank should write poetry have been well and truly consigned to oblivion. We took our cue from William Wordsworth, who wrote that poetry should be written in the real language of men. If I am right to say that poetic expression has largely moved into music and song, then it is our viewpoint that has triumphed. That is one of the ways that we paved the way for the four boys from Liverpool. Perhaps our battles with the critics about religion, politics, style also cleared the path for them. Another thing, if we were forerunners of your Beatles, then our influence on history might point to their future impact. And here, I have to say, the evidence is encouraging. I saw Shelley's Mask of Anarchy, which I published after the Great Reform Bill had passed in 1832, encouraging the growth of democracy in our country. I saw Lord Byron's intervention in Greece become an inspiration worldwide to those who dreamed of freedom from empire. I saw the work of John Keats recognised for its beauty and artistry. I would expect then that you will be able to see the Beatles creating similar after effects.
You've got mail. You've got mail.
Well, it seems I've got a message from the Mongolian Tourist Board. They've sent me a picture. Oh, that's nice. From Ulaanbaatar. Now, I would say that proves the truth of my friend Shelley's saying, "Poets are the unacknowledged legislators of the world." Well, we're getting very, very near the end now, but I did promise at the outset that I would explain my place in the First Fab Four's firmament. I think it may well have been dawning on you that I must have been the Ringo of the group. If so, I think you would be right. For one thing, just as his compositions have been judged to be, well, not quite of the same standard as those of his companions, so I have to admit that time has come to a similar adjudication in my case. That is one thing we have in common. Secondly, just as he sustained them with his steady backbeat, so I, in the Examiner, kept up an unremitting flow of news, commentary, poetry and reflections that encouraged and backed up their creations. And lastly, just as he did well in America, with 2 supremely successful songs, I believe, I can claim similar achievements. Let me tell you a little story. One day I was in my office working away and a little parcel was delivered. It was a copy of my recently published poem, The Story of Rimini, but it seemed to have been transformed by some kind of witchcraft. Though identical in terms of type and font, it was a little smaller and had a different binding. I turned it over a dozen times, wondering what it could be, and at length summoned other persons to partake in my astonishment. With their help, the simple solution of the puzzle was found. We consulted the title page and there saw the names of Wells and Lilly, Boston, and M. Carey, Philadelphia. So just like your Ringo, I had made good in America. So let's have no more of the King of the Cockneys. From now on, I would much prefer to be known as the Ringo of the Romantics. I must say I do like very much what I've heard of the last Beatles record, named after a street in London, I believe. Not far from my old place, in fact. Those lines about golden slumbers sung by Mr. Paul McCartney, I believe it's now Sir Paul McCartney, must get that right. Shelley was always telling me to give Lord Byron his title. Now, where was I? Oh yes, that song Golden Slumbers, that's right. Well, that song fits my state very well. In fact, I'm going to return to them now. Just before I leave, though, about that farewell song from them. Boy, you're going to carry that weight, carry that weight, carry that weight a long time. Well, we also had something like that, written in Venice by Lord Byron, which I always think stands for us all passing into history and becoming, like your Beatles, an eternal part of the human story. As my friend John Keats said, the poetry of earth is never dead.
So we'll go no more a-roving so late into the night, though the heart be still as loving and the moon be still as bright. For the sword outwears its sheath, and the soul outwears the breast, and the heart must pause to breathe, but love itself at rest. Though the night was made for loving, and the day returns too soon, yet we'll go